Welcome to a Healthy Push podcast. I'm Shannon Jackson, former anxiety sufferer turned adventure mom and anxiety recovery coach. I struggled with anxiety, panic disorder, and agoraphobia for 15 years. And now I help people to push past the stuff that I used to struggle with. Each week, I'll be sharing real and honest conversations along with actionable and practical steps that you can take to help you push past your anxious thoughts, the symptoms, panic, and fears. Welcome. You're right where you're meant to be. All right, let's talk about some common fears that people experience when struggling with anxiety, panic disorder, and agoraphobia. And I promise, with everything I create, I do my absolute best to be helpful rather than to be triggering. But some of this might be triggering to you, and that makes sense, and it's okay. I always tell my students being triggered is gonna happen, and we don't want to try to prevent ourselves from always being triggered, right? Because honestly, it's good practice for allowing yourself to feel anxious and to recognize that you can work through it and handle it. But the real reason why I created this episode is because when I was struggling, I remember walking into therapy literally week after week, feeling so freaking alone, isolated, and honestly crazy. And I remember one week saying to my therapist, "You've got to tell me that other people struggle with this same exact stuff because I honestly feel like I'm the only one." And I remember hearing those words, "Shannon, you're not alone." But these words never quite made me feel better. Because let's be real, as much as you can tell someone you're not alone and you can even recognize and know, like on some level, that this is true, you still feel really alone and isolated because people don't go around talking about the stuff that they're struggling with, especially the really hard stuff that carries shame and can be embarrassing. So my hope is that this episode makes you feel less alone and less isolated and helps you to carry less shame and makes you feel not so crazy. And I also hope that it just gives you some insights and practical tips and hope. So let's dive into the common fears I see when working with my students. And these are also things that I personally struggled with for years. Okay, the first one, being afraid to feel anxious and experience a panic attack. And I know you might be like, duh, Shannon, but I feel like I have to start here and talk about this one because it's one of the biggest reasons why people struggle so much with anxiety, panic, and agoraphobia. So people will often tell me, "Shannon, I had one anxious moment or one panic attack and I didn't know what the heck it was. It literally came out of nowhere and it was so scary." And after that moment, they started to approach things very differently, right? They started to approach things with lots more caution. They began to pull way back or they began to avoid. Or people tell me, "Shannon, I've experienced anxiety and panic from such a young age, and it's sort of always been with me and a part of my life, and things have just been so restricted and limited because of it." Whichever resonates with you, you might even be a little bit in between. It makes sense as to why you're afraid to feel anxious and experience panic. So let's talk more specifically about the fear of feeling anxious and experiencing panic. People are often afraid to feel anxious or experience panic in certain places or situations, right? So some big ones are places or situations that make you feel stuck or trapped, like in cars, on public transportation, at work, in elevators, while showering, while out on dates, in restaurants, at red lights, toward the back of the stores because you're further from the exits. And really the list goes on, right? But this is a big one. You can experience lots of anxiety when you feel stuck or trapped. Another one is people often feel afraid to feel anxious or experience panic in places or situations that they've experienced these things in before, like on the highway, on airplanes, driving over bridges, in big stores. Like there can be very specific memories that you have in certain places or situations when you felt incredibly anxious or experienced panic, and those things really can stick. Another one is people are often afraid to feel anxious or experience panic when they're alone, when they're far from home, or while they're with other people because they have that fear of embarrassment. I know this is such a big one. It's one that I struggled with a ton. I did not want anyone to see me feeling anxious or experiencing panic. but I also didn't want to be alone in case I needed help. This one is so common, not wanting to be alone, not wanting to be far from help, all of those things, not wanting to feel embarrassed. The next one, being in crowded places, being in open spaces, being far from areas in which help is readily available, being out when the weather isn't great. Like, I've heard it all and I've experienced a lot of it, really in any and all places and situations, right? Like, nothing seems to be off the table when it comes to anxiety and panic. And all of these make so much sense, right? But when it comes to feeling afraid to feel anxious or panic, I always tell people, of course you're scared to feel anxious and experience panic, especially in certain places or situations. And that's okay. But we're not trying to make you feel less scared. We're trying to teach you that you can feel scared and anxious while getting back to doing the things, right? Getting back to living your life. Because the reality is that it's not the place or the situation that's the problem. You're not actually afraid of driving or being stuck in traffic. You're afraid to feel. You're not actually afraid of the highway. You're afraid to feel. You're not actually afraid of the store. You're afraid to feel. You're not actually afraid of being far from home. You're afraid to feel. Do you see the theme here? Right? We're always resisting feeling. And that makes sense when you've experienced a lot of really uncomfortable feelings. But once you get better at making space for these uncomfortable feelings, for anxiety, and letting yourself feel it, doing these things, going to the places, being in the situations becomes a lot easier and the fear begins to fade. So yeah, just the fear of experiencing anxiety is a huge generator of anxiety, and this makes so much sense, but it is fixable. Okay, number 2, being afraid of how anxiety shows up for you, like in your body and your body's response to anxiety. So anxiety can manifest in lots of different ways. For some people, it's more in their chest, like in their heart or in their breathing. For some, it's feeling dizzy and lightheaded. For some, it's feeling nauseous or having stomach issues. For some, it's feeling off or detached, which is often referred to as depersonalization or derealization or dissociation. For some, it's lots of anxious and intrusive thoughts that just never seem to shut up. For you, maybe it's a combination of some of these things, or maybe it's literally all of these things. But I want to break these things down a little, like talk about them a little bit more. So if you feel anxiety more in your chest or your heart, like with palpitations, tightness, a heaviness, etc., it can make you feel really afraid that something bad is happening or is going to happen, right? And it can cause you to really fixate on things like your heart rate and your breathing. And let's be real, it doesn't feel great to feel your heart pounding seemingly out of the middle of nowhere, or even when it's not out of the middle of nowhere, or to feel like there's something sitting on top of your chest, or to feel like you're not breathing, quote, normally and you can't catch a good breath. Like, it can feel really scary. And of course, all of this can feel really scary because it's like, I need my heart to function, quote, normally, right? I need my lungs to function normally. So if you struggle with this stuff, you might often find yourself checking your heart rate, avoiding raising your heart rate, trying to control your breathing. If these are things that you struggle with, the palpitations, the tightness, the heaviness, I want to encourage you to listen to episode number 78. I talk more about this in that episode. Okay, the next one. If you feel anxiety more in your head, like feeling dizzy or lightheaded or just off, it can make you feel really afraid that you're not stable, right? Like that your balance is off, or you might pass out, or just something bad is going to happen. And this one can be tough because it can make you feel really afraid to go anywhere or do things because it feels more dangerous to do things, right, while feeling off or dizzy or lightheaded. So you might find yourself never wanting to be alone, like you're always doing things with other people. Or you might find yourself always wanting something to hold on to, like a person or a wall or a cart, like if you're in stores. Or you might carry snacks with you, like sugary snacks, to prevent yourself from feeling dizzy, lightheaded, or off. Or you might just constantly be looking for a reason why you feel dizzy. So if this is something that you struggle with, I have a couple of episodes. I talk about dizziness also in that episode number 78, and I talk about the fear of passing out in episode number 145. Those will be really helpful. Okay, the next one, if you feel anxiety more in your stomach, like you experience nausea, cramping, diarrhea, like all the things, of course, it can cause you to be really afraid to do things because let's be real, like nobody wants to be out and about while their stomach is a mess. Like you want to be home, right? When you're feeling these things. And people who struggle with anxiety showing up in their stomach oftentimes struggle with toilet anxiety, which you've probably heard me talk about. It's something that I struggled with for years, which is really common. I know I used to feel incredibly alone, like there's nobody else that's struggling with this, but I've worked with hundreds of people who struggle with toilet anxiety, which is essentially just the fear of not being able to make it to a bathroom in time if you need one. So if you struggle with this stuff, the stomach stuff, the toilet stuff, I have a couple of podcast episodes and I have a whole mini course on toilet anxiety. Okay, the next one, if you feel anxiety more in your mind, like whether it's feeling off, detached, removed, this can be really scary because it can make you feel like you're not connected, right, to yourself or to the present moment, which can feel uncomfortable and even startling. You know, some people will say, it feels like I'm in a dream. It feels like I'm outside of my body. It scares me because it makes me feel like nothing is real. And it can make you feel really afraid, right, that you don't have control, which is a lot of what anxiety comes down to. And then you find yourself desperately trying to make sure that you are connected, trying to bring yourself back to the moment, like trying to force it. If this is stuff that you struggle with, I have a whole episode on depersonalization, derealization. That's number 147. So you'll want to check that out. Okay, the next one, if you feel anxiety more in your mind, like with being bombarded with lots of anxious thoughts and intrusive thoughts, it can cause you to feel so freaking frustrated because it feels like you're constantly fighting with your mind. And if you struggle with lots of anxious thoughts, you have probably recognized that one of the worst parts is that the thoughts can lead to lots of sensations and symptoms, and I'm sure they do. And in general, when your mind is throwing lots of anxious and intrusive thoughts your way, you can feel like peace is something that is never going to be achievable. So you might find yourself trying to stop the thoughts, trying to control the thoughts, trying to think your way out of having the thoughts and feelings, which is all just incredibly unhelpful. So if you struggle with lots of the anxious thoughts, intrusive thoughts, episode 117 is going to be helpful. And also I have a whole masterclass on overcoming your what if thoughts. So in general, I wanted to touch on each of these slightly, but I want to say in general, all of these things are so tough because you don't want to feel or experience any of them, right? Like the truth, the reality, they can be scary, they can be uncomfortable, and just downright shitty. And because you don't want to experience them, you might often find yourself scanning and checking for the sensations, the symptoms, the thoughts, like trying to get ahead of these things. You're trying to prevent them from happening. And then when you are experiencing them, you're trying to do anything and everything to make them go away. And another really hard aspect is that because of the fear, right, you're convinced that these things are more than just anxiety. Like there is no way that this is just anxiety. There's got to be something wrong with my heart. There's got to be something wrong with my stomach, my mind, on and on and on, right? And one of the hardest parts of recovery, and is something that I work with my students a lot on, is accepting that it is anxiety. Because once you start practicing that it is anxiety and you start getting better at that acceptance, things become so much easier. So however anxiety shows up for you, I want you to recognize that your body is responding in a perfectly normal way to anxiety. The heart stuff, the stomach stuff, the mind stuff, it's all normal. The thoughts, the sensations, the symptoms are just anxiety's way of saying, hey, we're overwhelmed. You need to slow things down. You need to approach things in a healthier way. So when it comes to reducing the symptoms and developing the trust within yourself and your body and getting that calmness, I always say we're not going to focus specifically on the heart stuff or the breathing stuff or the depersonalization, the derealization. We're not going to tackle the specific thoughts, sensations, symptoms, and we're not going to try to keep making these things go away. Instead, we're going to focus on changing your response to anxiety overall, because it's all anxiety. And when you change your response, anxiety stops showing up in all of these ways. And I just kind of want to reiterate this before we leave this one. Of course, you're afraid of how anxiety shows up for you. This is really how we get on that cycle of struggling with anxiety, panic, and agoraphobia. We're afraid of how anxiety causes us to feel. And then we try to think and do our way out of that feeling, which just causes us to stay on this fear loop. It really is. You're just scared to feel. Okay, number 3, being afraid that you're going crazy, that you're losing your mind, or the anxiety will get so bad that you will go crazy. This one is so common. I can tell you that there were many times throughout my journey that I really thought I was going crazy, that I was convinced like this isn't just anxiety, I am literally losing my mind. I struggled with anxiety and panic nearly every day for over a decade. And there were many times that I convinced myself that I was going crazy or that someday I'd end up in a hospital because the anxiety would get so bad. You know, with all the thoughts, the sensations, the symptoms, it can really make you feel like you're going crazy at times. But I want you to hear me. You are not going crazy. You are not losing your mind. You are very, very sane. And you don't need to try to convince yourself that you aren't going crazy or that you won't go crazy, because this is not your reality. We don't need to try to prevent this from happening. We know what you're struggling with is anxiety, panic, agoraphobia. It can make you feel like you're absolutely losing your mind, but you're not. You are very, very sane. So when you have this thought, do your best to let it in, let it go. Remember, having thoughts doesn't make them true. And I'm not spending a ton of time on this one because I just want you to hear plainly and simply, we're not trying to convince yourself that you're not going crazy. Like this is not what's happening. Okay, the next one, being afraid of people seeing you feel anxious or experiencing panic. I sort of mentioned this briefly earlier, but I feel like this one needs to be talked about separately because it's such a big one for a lot of people. Like, it's what causes the fear to be even greater, right? Like, I already feel anxious. I already don't feel good. I feel so uncomfortable and scared, and I'm experiencing panic. But additionally, I don't want anyone to see this. And this is one of the really tough parts about the anxiety recovery journey, is that there are always layers. Like, it's not just anxiety, there's always other things, right? There's embarrassment, there's shame, and these are things that make the journey even tougher. It can feel embarrassing to experience anxiety or panic in front of other people. And so lots of people will hide and do hide the fact that they're feeling anxious or experiencing panic, or just that they're struggling in general. I remember having so many panic attacks and just pretending like I was fine, nothing was happening. And on the outside, I'm sure nobody could tell that I was absolutely losing it internally. Like, I would sit in meetings at work, I would sit in the car, I would even be presenting. I would just be looking like Shannon's her normal, but it felt like there was nothing normal going on. Like, I was truly internally losing it. And it honestly made the panic attacks suck even more because I was already trying to resist what was happening. Like, I was already trying to make myself not panic. And additionally, I was trying to make it so that nobody would see that I was panicking. I was always trying to hide it. And this is something that I know so many people do, whether you're just hiding the anxiety and panic in the moment, or whether you're hiding the experience overall. Like, you don't want people to know that you're struggling, and you especially don't want people to know to the level that you're struggling with anxiety, panic, and agoraphobia. So something I often hear from my students is this: I look around and it seems like everyone else is fine. Like, nobody's experiencing anxiety or panic, but I am a complete mess. And I always love to challenge this idea, because I think so many of us aren't walking around feeling at peace or feeling happiness. And many of us are walking around, right, experiencing really tough stuff. I think a lot of us just have become really good at hiding our struggles and our emotions. So this idea that everyone is okay except for you is far from the truth. I always say, if everyone were more vulnerable and just shared openly what they were feeling and experiencing, like the world would be such a more peaceful place. And I know it's so hard to share because so many people are walking around with those masks on. We're all pretending. So I know it's really hard to share, but letting ourselves be seen for what is happening, right? What is going on within us, and allowing ourselves to be human is how we actually are able to heal. And so letting yourself feel embarrassed is part of this. I know you don't want people to see you feeling anxious or experiencing the panic, but it's okay for them to see it. And I know it might make it uncomfortable, but it's okay. Like, we all feel this stuff, right? And we've got to let ourselves be human. Okay, number 5, being afraid that you'll regress, go back to struggling really bad again, and it'll be worse than ever. This fear makes so much sense. You've experienced some really hard stuff and you've made lots of progress, and you don't ever want things to go back to the way that they were. You don't ever want things to be that hard again. And of course you don't. And let's be real, right? Our brains are so freaking good about remembering those really hard moments. You know, this fear usually pops up when you've just experienced a lot of anxiety or panic seemingly out of the blue, or more panic than usual, or just when you've been going through some hard times. Or it even pops up when you've been doing really well and not experiencing much anxiety at all. And then you think, okay, this doesn't feel normal. Like, where the heck is it? How am I feeling this good? And then you start to analyze the heck out of why you're feeling good. It's like you don't believe it's possible, and anxiety must be right around the corner. So however this fear pops up, I just want you to recognize, right, this is fear, and we don't need to try to prevent yourself from regressing. Instead, we need to stay focused on today, what's happening in the right now. Because staying here in the present is where you actually have control. And that's what's going to help you to keep moving forward and to heal. And honestly, I like to look at it this way. What if the worst has already happened and it's behind you? What if that was as bad as it ever gets? What if you've already seen it, experienced it, been through the worst, and you got yourself through it? I like to think that this is true. Right? And we need to let go of this tight grip on control that we have to try to make ourselves never go back or experience hard things again. When you loosen that grip, right, you're more accepting just of what is, and allowing yourself to be present, and allowing yourself to be in the present, right, is actually what helps you to continue to move forward and to heal. And really, it's just not helpful, right, to convince ourselves that bad stuff is always going to happen. You know, what about all the good things that are happening right now? And what about all the good things that are ahead? So again, I just encourage you to stay focused on today. Stay focused on the healthy steps that you're taking right now. We don't need to try to prevent yourself from regressing or going back or struggling worse than you've ever struggled. Okay, number 6 and the last one, being afraid that you'll never get better. I know this is such a big one. This is one that I battled with so much. You know, when you struggle with anxiety for any amount of time, months, years, it can make you feel really sad, really hopeless, really depressed. And it can convince you that you're never going to get better and that you're always going to struggle with anxiety in some form. Like, maybe you are just an anxious person. Maybe you were just born this way. Maybe you aren't capable of living a life without struggling with anxiety. These things are not true, but I know how much when you're in it that you can really be convinced of these things. You know, I was there. I used to convince myself of all of these things. I used to convince myself that because of the genetic factors, because of how long I had struggled, because of how bad I had struggled, I'd never get better. And at one of the lowest points during my journey, I remember having a really intense panic attack. And I told my mom, if this is what my life is going to look like, I don't want to do it anymore. I can't. And I will never forget saying these words to her. It's truly how I felt. Like, I didn't want to die,
but I didn't want to live being consumed by so much anxiety and panic. And it just felt like there was never an off switch. Like I didn't have the control and I couldn't change it. And I know so many people have felt the same way. And maybe this is something that you felt recently or are currently feeling. And if so, I want you to hear me. This is all fear. And of course, you're scared. Of course, you're scared that you'll never get better. But I don't care how long you've been struggling or how badly, you are capable of healing and creating a healthy relationship with anxiety. You aren't just an anxious person, and you weren't just born this way. To heck with these fearful stories. You are absolutely capable of healing. And you can feel afraid that you'll never heal, but don't let that fear stop you from continuing to live in the present moment and take those healthy steps. All right. That was a lot, and I feel like I could go on because there are so many fears that people struggle with when struggling with anxiety, panic disorder, and agoraphobia. So maybe this episode is one of several, but I just wanted to start here because these are like the core fears, right? These are the biggest ones, and sort of all the other things like fall into one of these categories. But my hope really is that this episode has helped you to feel more seen and validated and heard and less alone. And I hope that it's helped you to feel less weird and crazy and broken because you are none of these things. Well, maybe you're a little weird and crazy like me, but that's not a bad thing. But you are not broken. I always tell my students, you are not doing this work to fix you. You aren't broken. You're doing this work to fix your relationship with anxiety, and you are capable of this. So no matter your fears, no matter how long you've been struggling or how badly you've been struggling, you are capable of doing this work. And don't convince yourself otherwise. All right, until next time, keep taking healthy action.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Healthy Push. If you want more, head on over to ahealthypush.com for the show notes and lots more tips, tools, and inspiration that will support your recovery. And if you're hoping for me to cover a certain topic, be sure to join my Instagram community at A Healthy Push and let me know in the comments what you want to hear next.